Imagine waking up with a slight feeling of unease, a subtle fever, a dull ache in your armpits. You think tiredness from the day before. You drink water, lie back down. You don't know this is your last dawn. Your neighbor was buried yesterday. Your wife has been coughing since midnight. And the church bells, which should ring once per death, won't stop. They ring all day long. This was not fiction. It was the reality for millions of Europeans between 1347 and 1353. And what they lived through was the greatest biological catastrophe that humanity has ever recorded in all of its history. We are talking about a disease that in less than 6 years wiped out between 30 and 60% of the European population. Conservative estimates point to 25 million dead in Europe alone. For comparison, the Spanish flu of 1918, which haunts generations to this day, killed between 50 and 100 million people around the entire world over 2 years of global devastation. Smallpox, over centuries of circulation, was responsible for the death of approximately 300 million human beings. AIDS, since the 1980s, has accumulated around 40 million lives lost. But the Black Death did something none of those diseases managed. It destroyed half an entire continent in a single generation. And it did so without warning, without treatment, without mercy. This is the story of Yersinia pestis, a bacterium of murderous efficiency that rewrote the map of the world. This is the Black Death, and it begins long before the first corpse.
To grasp the full extent of the destruction that would follow, we must first understand what was destroyed. The 14th century did not begin as an age of darkness. It began as a pinnacle. The Europe of the early 14th century was experiencing a period of flourishing without precedent since the Roman Empire. Cities were growing, trade was exploding, cathedrals were rising to the heavens with ambition and faith. The medieval warm period had guaranteed decades of abundant harvests. The European population had nearly doubled between 1000 and 1300. Paris had more than 200,000 inhabitants. Florence and Venice rivaled each other in wealth. Universities were being born. Philosophy was flourishing. Trade routes stretched from England to China. A Venetian merchant could buy Asian silk without ever leaving the protected networks of the Pax Mongolica. This was a glorious and confident world, a world that believed it was drawing closer to God, not walking toward the abyss. But all that prosperity carried within it a fatal vulnerability. Cities far too dense, narrow streets with open sewers, rats in every cellar, fleas in every bed, people sleeping 5 to a mattress, the perfect infrastructure for a biological disaster. And the same trade routes that spread silk, spices, and gold were about to carry something far more powerful and devastating, a bacterium that knew no borders, no king. The origin of the Black Death lies in the vast steppes of Central Asia, likely in present-day Kyrgyzstan or northern China, a landscape of extremes, brutal winter, scorching summer, endless horizon. There, in the colonies of burrowing rodents, marmots, ground squirrels, rats, a bacterium called Yersinia pestis had lived for millennia, silent, efficient, patient, waiting for the right moment to leap. For centuries, the bacterium existed in balance with its natural hosts. The rodents died, the fleas jumped to new hosts. The cycle repeated without ever reaching dense human populations. But in the 1330s, something broke that balance. Climate historians identified a period of severe ecological stress. Devastating droughts, followed by torrential rains, destroyed the food sources of the rodents. Starving and desperate, the infected rodents migrated closer to human settlements, and their fleas, carrying Yersinia pestis, came with them. The first human victims did not understand what was happening. They developed high fever, uncontrollable vomiting, and a terrifying symptom: enormous, painful swellings in the lymph nodes, the so-called buboes. The buboes appeared in the groin, the armpits, the neck. They started the size of an almond. Within days, they grew to the size of an orange, then an apple. The skin around them turned black. The pain was described by survivors as unbearable, an internal pressure that seemed to want to burst through the very flesh. Many delirious with fever before the buboes had even reached their full size. When the infection reached the blood, the so-called septicemic form, black and purple blotches covered the entire body. Internal hemorrhages, gangrene in the extremities. Death came in hours, not days. There was also a third form,
pneumonic plague. When the bacterium attacked the lungs, the patient coughed blood and expelled infectious droplets into the air. In this form, simply breathing near someone was enough to die.
The geographic turning point of this story is the Crimean Peninsula on the northern shore of the Black Sea. There stood Caffa, a fortified Genoese colony, cosmopolitan and enormously wealthy, a gateway between Asia and Europe. In 1346, Caffa was under siege by the army of the Golden Horde, led by Khan Jani Beg. The Genoese were holding out. They were masters of maritime defense, and the siege dragged on for months in a brutal stalemate. But then, in the Mongol camps, the silent killer began to act. Soldiers fell sick and died by the hundreds, then by the thousands. Their bodies darkened with gangrene before death arrived. The besieging army was disintegrating not from enemy action, but from biological collapse. And it was in that moment of desperation that Jani Beg made a decision that would forever change the course of human history. He ordered that the corpses of his soldiers, infected, putrefied, and still teeming with bacteria, be loaded onto trebuchets and hurled over the walls of Caffa. An act of biological warfare. For days, the sky over Caffa rained bodies. The Genoese defenders watched in horror as the pestilent corpses crashed against rooftops and public squares, spreading fluids and fleas throughout the city. The psychological impact was devastating. The biological impact was immediate. The fleas, abandoning their cold hosts, sought human warmth. The impregnable fortress had been conquered from within. Panic gripped Caffa. The Genoese merchants, realizing the city was doomed, used their greatest asset, their ships. 12 galleys departed, loaded with refugees, merchandise, and an invisible passenger. They sailed through the Bosphorus, passed through Constantinople, which would soon also be devastated, and entered the Mediterranean. The sea that was the economic engine of Europe had become the road of death. The first major European port to fall was Messina in Sicily in October 1347. When the Genoese galleys arrived, the dockworkers who rowed out to receive them were met with a scene from a nightmare. Chroniclers of the time recorded that most of the sailors were dead, their bodies rotting on the deck under the Sicilian sun. The few survivors were delirious, seized by fever, unable to hold an oar. Their bodies were covered in black boils, dripping with blood and pus. A nauseating stench rose from the vessels. The authorities in Messina tried to expel the ships, but it was already too late. The black rats, ever-present companions on any medieval ship, had already used the mooring ropes to reach the docks, and each rat carried dozens of fleas, and each flea, death. Messina was the test, and Europe failed miserably. Within weeks, the social fabric of the port city disintegrated. People fled to the countryside, carrying the infection with them without knowing it. Other ports tried to close their anchorages to suspect ships, but medieval greed was a porous sieve. A ship loaded with valuable spices always found someone willing to be bribed. At the start of 1348, the great Italian maritime republics were collapsing. Genoa, home port of the ships from Caffa, was devastated with a particular and symbolic cruelty, as if history were collecting a debt. Venice, the queen of the Adriatic, faced an existential threat. The pragmatic Venetians created the concept of the Lazaretto, quarantine islands where ships and crews waited 40 giorni before entering the city. 40 giorni, 40 days. That is where the word quarantine comes from. A pioneering public health measure born of desperation. But for the first wave, it was already too late. The gondolas had become funeral barges. From the Italian ports, the disease flew westward to Marseille, the main gateway to France. It crossed the Adriatic to Dubrovnik. The coastal perimeter of Europe had been completely breached. As the plague advanced inland, following rivers and Roman roads, it found the beating heart of medieval Europe. And what it found was the perfect environment in which to multiply without limit. Paris, Florence, London, Barcelona, cities alive, dense, loud, narrow alleys where the upper floors of houses nearly touched, blocking out the sun. Open sewers running down the middle of the streets, rats in every cellar and grain warehouse, fleas in every mattress, on every domestic animal's fur, in the seams of clothes that were never washed. Medieval hygiene was a death sentence. When the plague entered a large city, it did not only kill people, It killed the city as a functioning organism, and it did so with a speed that made any organized response simply impossible. The first to fall ill were the poorest, who lived in the most precarious conditions, but the bacterium had no respect for wealth. Within weeks, the rich were also falling sick inside their well-built homes. The cycle of the disease was terrifying in its predictability. First, the fever, high, sudden, accompanied by violent chills and intense muscle pain, as if the bones were being squeezed from within. Then the nausea, constant vomiting that exhausted the already weakened body. The skin became hypersensitive to touch. Even the weight of a sheet caused unbearable pain. And then the buboes appeared. The swelling in the lymph nodes was accompanied by intense local heat. The skin around it turned red, then purple, then black. The sick screamed when anyone tried to touch the affected area. Some buboes burst spontaneously, releasing pus and dark blood. It was believed that these were the cases of recovery, and sometimes they were, but most buboes hardened and killed within 3 to 5 days. The odor was unbearable. The sick exhaled a sweetish, putrid odor that soaked into walls, furniture, and bedclothes. Neighbors could identify an infected house even before entering it. At night, delirium seized the sick. Fevers of 40, 41 degrees provoked vivid hallucinations. Respected men cried out for people dead for decades. Mothers failed to recognize their own children. And then came the silence. The fever dropped suddenly. The sick seemed to improve for a few hours, a cruel relief that gave families hope. But it was the prelude to death, not the beginning of a cure.
We must understand the absolute terror of facing a disease like this without any of the resources we consider basic today. No antibiotics, no microscopes, no germ theory, absolutely nothing. The brightest minds of the 14th century, the physicians of the University of Paris, the doctors of Oxford, the apothecaries of Florence, were completely lost. Their knowledge was useless before the bacterium. The theoretical basis of medieval medicine was the doctrine of humors, inherited from the Greeks. The body was governed by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Disease was their imbalance. Alongside the humors, there was miasma theory, corrupted air as the vehicle of disease. The Faculty of Medicine in Paris in 1348 issued an official report blaming a planetary alignment of 1345. Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in conjunction had released noxious vapors from the earth and the water. That was the official explanation. And from it, doctors prescribed practices that today make the hair stand on end. Do not bathe. The open pores let in the corrupted air. Do not eat fruit and vegetables. They are too moist and unbalance the humors. Stay in closed, warm rooms. Each piece of advice was a death wish. The doctors who dared to attend the sick wore the famous protective garments, long leather cloaks, gloves, wide-brimmed hats, and a long beak like that of a bird. In the beak of the mask, they placed aromatic herbs, lavender, mint, cloves, juniper, in the belief that the strong scent would block the miasmas. It was a useless suit of armor, but it revealed the absolute terror they felt. The main treatment was bloodletting. The doctor would open the vein in the arm with a lancet and let the blood flow, sometimes for hours, in the belief that it would flush out the corrupted humors. It only weakened the patients. Other treatments included vinegar baths, poultices of herbs applied to the buboes, and the inhalation of sulfur smoke. Nothing worked. The best doctors were incapable of saving a single life. The worst advice of all, lancing the buboes. When the doctor cut into the swelling, the bacterium entered directly into the bloodstream, accelerating the septicemic form. The attempt at a cure became a death sentence. The mortality rate among the doctors themselves was extremely high. Many simply fled the cities. Those who stayed died. And the realization that their best knowledge was useless generated a deep psychological crisis. For the first time in medieval history, man looked to reason, his most powerful weapon, and saw that it served no purpose. That realization would transform Europe forever, decades later.
Giovanni Boccaccio was in Florence when the plague arrived. He survived, and he left us in the prologue to his work, The Decameron, one of the most disturbing accounts of social collapse ever written in literary history. Boccaccio described a city that had abandoned the laws that made it human. The terror of contagion was so great that the most sacred bonds were broken, one by one, with a frightening coldness. Parents abandoned sick children in their beds and shut the door. Wives left dying husbands to flee. Brothers avoided brothers. Human solidarity, built over millennia, evaporated within weeks. The sick were walled into their own homes, a practice the authorities encouraged. The entire family, infected or not, was locked in from outside. Food was left on the doorstep. The machinery of the city stopped. Bakeries closed when the bakers died.
Butcher shops rotted with meats and no buyers. Tailors abandoned their fabrics mid-cut. Courts closed because there were no judges. Construction halted because there were no masons. Markets emptied because there were no vendors. Medieval urban life was a complex web, and the web came undone. Silence settled over cities that had never been silent. The alleys that had always echoed with voices, vendors' cries, the creak of carts, and the hammering of blacksmiths fell empty. Mute, terrifying. That silence was only broken by the constant tolling of church bells, each toll a death. In Florence, the tolling was so continuous and maddening that the authorities banned the bells to contain the panic. The dead piled up faster than they could be buried. The cemeteries filled within weeks. The consecrated soil of the churches was exhausted. And then came the mass graves, vast, nameless trenches. Bodies were stacked in layers, as if they were logs of wood, a layer of corpses, a thin covering of earth, another layer of corpses. No coffin, no ceremony, no dignity whatsoever. In Avignon, the papal seat at the time, Pope Clement VI was forced to consecrate the Rhone River itself as a sacred cemetery so that bodies thrown into the water would be considered buried in holy ground. Looting became routine. The homes of the dead were emptied by neighbors before the bodies had even grown cold. Those with nothing to lose roamed the empty streets, carrying off whatever they could find. A chilling detail recorded by several chroniclers. Domestic dogs and cats, abandoned by dead or fleeing owners, formed hungry packs that prowled the cities in search of food. And what they found in those deserted streets were the corpses that no one had collected. The scene survivors described was of a world that had simply ended without ceremony.
In the 14th century, there was no separation between the physical and the spiritual world. An event of this magnitude could have only one interpretation. God was punishing humanity for its sins. There was no other possible explanation. The church, the absolute foundation of medieval life, faced its greatest test. People flocked to cathedrals in desperate processions, praying for deliverance, and thus, crowded together in enclosed spaces, they accelerated their own deaths. When the prayers failed, when the priests died just as fast as the sinners, an impossible question arose. Where was God? The question had no answer, and the void it created was filled by despair. It was in this context of religious terror that the flagellant movement was born. In 1348, groups of hundreds of men began marching through the cities of Northern Europe on a self-destructive and terrifying mission. They wore identical tunics with embroidered crosses. They marched in silence, barefoot with covered heads. Upon entering a public square, they formed a circle and began the ritual that defined them as a movement. Twice a day, they stripped to the waist and flogged themselves with leather whips fitted with iron tips. They shed blood publicly. The penance was total, visceral, terrifying. They believed that by punishing their own flesh, they would carry the sins of humanity and appease divine wrath. Crowds watched in silence. Women fainted. Children wept. It was a spectacle of collective despair. The flagellants also became vectors of disease, marching from city to city, drawing crowds, spreading pneumonic plague through airborne droplets as they prayed aloud and wept together in groups. Pope Clement VI in Avignon finally condemned the movement in September 1349, but the seed of questioning had been planted. The church that could neither explain nor stop death had lost its moral authority. When fear finds no rational answer, it looks for a culprit. It is one of the darkest and most persistent tendencies of human nature, and in the 14th century, it found an old and available target. A horrible theory spread through the Holy Roman Empire that Jewish communities were poisoning the water wells of Christian cities, a deliberate conspiracy to exterminate the faithful. The theory had no basis whatsoever. Jews were dying of plague exactly like Christians. Pope Clement VI himself issued 2 papal bulls stating this explicitly, ordering that Jews be protected. But rationality had no place against the collective panic fueled by centuries of institutional anti-Semitism. The papal bulls were ignored. The hunger for blame was more powerful than any authority. In Strasbourg, in February 1349, around 2,000 Jews were gathered in the community cemetery. Men, women, children. A great wooden pyre was built, and they were burned alive. In Mainz, the Jewish community, realizing what was coming, chose resistance. They fought back against the attackers with weapons, but they were too few against an enraged mob. They were exterminated to the last. In Cologne, Frankfurt, Speyer, Worms, in dozens of German cities, the same barbarity was repeated. Communities that had lived in those places for centuries
were destroyed in a wave of irrational violence. The Black Death unleashed not only biological horror, it activated the most primitive and destructive aspects of human nature. Fear turned communities into mobs. Ignorance became mass murder.
It is a mistake to picture the Black Death as an exclusively urban phenomenon. Although the cities were the epicenters, 90% of the European population lived in the countryside, and the plague arrived there too, more slowly, but just as deadly. The disease reached rural areas through refugees from the cities, through traveling merchants, through pilgrims who carried the infected fleas unknowingly in the folds of their clothing and in bales of merchandise. When the disease struck a small village, the result was often complete extinction. Without doctors, without priests, without any system of mutual aid, rural communities were even more vulnerable than the cities. Chroniclers of the time describe rural scenes of surreal nightmare, ripe harvests rotting in the fields with no one to gather them, the grain that would feed the winter lost because all the peasants had died. Flocks of sheep, goats, and cattle wandered aimlessly across the landscape, gradually turning feral because all the shepherds had perished. The medieval landscape, carefully cultivated by generations, was dissolving. Wolves began to approach human settlements again, emboldened by the silence and the absence of pursuit. Records show packs entering deserted villages and carrying off the unburied dead. Thousands of small villages disappeared from Europe in this period. Their names were lost. Today, archaeologists find the traces of these ghost communities, foundations, wells, cemeteries without crosses, buried beneath the fields. The feudal system, which depended on a constant supply of serf labor to function, was collapsing. Without peasants, the lord's lands were worth nothing. Medieval power was beginning to crack.
By 1350, the first great wave of the Black Death was reaching its geographic limits: Scotland, Scandinavia, Poland, and finally the small Nordic settlements of Greenland, where it struck the Viking colonies. It had traversed all of Europe, from the warm Mediterranean to the frozen Arctic, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Russian steppes. It had encountered no geographical, political, or religious barrier capable of stopping it. By 1351, the bacterium had simply run out of easily accessible victims. The population had been so decimated that potential carriers were physically far from one another. The wave burned itself out. The fog began to lift, and what it revealed was a continent transformed irreversibly, a world that had the same rivers, the same cities, the same churches, but that was fundamentally different. The numbers are hard to process even today. Modern historians estimate between 75 and 200 million dead across Eurasia and North Africa. In Europe alone, approximately 25 million, half the population of the continent. In some regions, mortality was even higher. Florence lost between 60 and 70% of its inhabitants. In certain rural villages, the rate was 100%. Complete extinction, entire families erased from the earth. And the disease did not disappear. It would return in smaller waves in 1360, 1369, 1374, 1390, striking each new generation born without immunity, rewriting European demographics for more than 3 centuries.
The period immediately following the peak of the plague was one of total economic chaos. Inflation soared, trade collapsed. Cities that depended on complex commercial circuits saw their economies evaporate overnight. But then, something remarkable and unexpected happened. The mass depopulation created a severe labor shortage, and that shortage redistributed power in a way that no revolution had managed before. For the first time in centuries, the peasant had bargaining power. Feudal lords, desperate to find someone to till their lands, were forced to pay wages, offer better conditions, negotiate. The serfs, who had been tied to the land for generations, simply got up and left, offering their labor to whoever paid more. Feudal serfdom began to crack, and in many places it crumbled entirely. Historians call this period the golden age of the medieval worker. Born from the ashes, fertilized by the death of half of Europe, it was one of the greatest redistributions of economic power in Western history. The psychological scars were equally deep and lasting. European art became obsessed with death. The danse macabre, dances of skeletons with kings, popes, and beggars, invaded churches and manuscripts.
The message was simple and devastating. Death is the great equalizer. The king dies as naked as the peasant. The bishop's mitre offers no protection against the buboes. Before the bacterium, all are equal. The optimism of the High Middle Ages had been destroyed forever. The certainty that God protected the faithful, that reason explained the world, that progress was inevitable, all of it had been called into question. And it was precisely that radical questioning, born of collective trauma, that opened the way for the Renaissance, for humanism, for the Protestant Reformation, for modern science. Death had generated rebirth.
The Black Death was not a single event. It was the beginning of an era of pestilence that lasted more than 3 centuries. The second wave came in 1360, the third in 1369, and so, generation by generation, the bacterium returned. Each new wave found a young population with no acquired immunity, vulnerable. The survivors of the first wave seemed to have developed some resistance, but their children and grandchildren were new and defenseless targets. In some regions, the European population did not recover the levels of 1340 until the 17th century, nearly 300 years later. 300 years of slow recovery, repeatedly interrupted by new outbreaks of the same disease. The last great epidemic of bubonic plague in Western Europe was the one in Marseille in 1720. More than 3 centuries after Messina, the bacterium returned and killed half the city in 2 years. Yersinia pestis is patient. Today, bubonic plague still exists. The World Health Organization records between 1,000 and 3,000 cases per year, mainly in Africa, Asia, and South America. Treated with common antibiotics, it has a mortality rate below 10%. The same bacterium that exterminated half of medieval Europe is today treated with a week of antibiotics. That distance between the 14th century and the present reveals, better than any speech, what science truly represents. Yersinia pestis was identified only in 1894 by the bacteriologist Alexandre Yersin, hence its name. More than 5 centuries after the Black Death, humanity finally put a face to the killer that had changed the world. In 1898, Paul-Louis Simon discovered the role of the flea as the vector of transmission between rodents and humans. The mechanism that had killed 200 million people was understood in detail only at the threshold of the 20th century. The first effective antibiotic against the bacterium, streptomycin, was developed in 1943. 600 years of devastation, 6 centuries of pain, of mass graves, of ghost cities, and the solution fit in a single injection. The dead of the Black Death have no names carved on monuments. Most went to mass graves without ceremony, but they existed, they loved, they worked, they prayed, and their deaths, brutal as they were not in vain, because it was upon the rubble they left behind that the modern world was built. Every medical discovery, every advance in public health, every vaccine carries invisibly within its history the trace of those tens of millions of lives. But the most disturbing lesson of the Black Death is not biological, it is human. It is about how societies react when they face the incomprehensible, when fear overrides reason, when the search for culprits overrides the search for solutions. The flagellants flogged themselves because they did not understand the bacterium. The mobs burned Jews because they had no microscope. The doctors bled the patients because they did not know microbiology. Ignorance killed as surely as the disease. And what separates us from them today is not that we are smarter or braver or morally superior. It is that we have the knowledge they did not have. And that knowledge, built on centuries of suffering, is our greatest patrimony.
For centuries, we have treated the Black Death as a distant medieval nightmare, a story from another time, from a superstitious and ignorant Europe that today would be incapable of making the same mistakes. But empty streets, cities in silence, overwhelmed hospitals, the dead buried without ceremony, scapegoats created by ignorance and fear, science challenged by absurd theories. Does that sound like ancient history? Or does it sound like something you have seen, felt, or lived, perhaps not so long ago? Yersinia pestis was the first test. Humanity sat for others, with other agents, other names. The Black Death was the greatest test that Western civilization ever faced. It revealed both the worst of human nature, fear, violence, the search for culprits, and its capacity for reconstruction. Because what is remarkable is not only that Europe almost died, it is that it survived, that those who remained rebuilt, reinvented, questioned, that from the greatest trauma came the greatest cultural flourishing. And that lesson, that civilization is fragile, that human systems can collapse within weeks, but that the human capacity to rebuild is also real.
That lesson belongs to all of us. History is not a collection of dates and battles. It is the record of the choices human beings made when life placed them before the impossible. Each generation has its own test. Studying it is not a distant academic exercise. It is to hear what they lived through, to understand what they could not understand, and to carry that knowledge as collective responsibility for the future that is yet to come. Every generation faces its own invisible enemy. The difference between those who survive and those who collapse is always found in the same place, in accumulated knowledge, in solidarity, and in the ability to act with reason. I am Frank, observing the past so that we may understand the present, and together we keep history reborn. See you in the next era.